Going inside the issues of our community, this is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. Money may not be able to buy happiness, but it sure can buy political ads, mass mailings, and the salaries of campaign staffers. Cold, hard cash is the mother's milk of politics. There are rules for raising political money, whether you are running nationally for president or locally for council or county clerk. But in this Local 12 investigation, reporter Jeff Hirsh shows us how some big loopholes may make it easy to get around those rules when someone is running for judge.
Thank you, Ohio.
When you're running for office, two things are absolutely critical: passion.
When you go to the polling place, the name George W. Bush will not be on the ballot, and that makes you happy.
And money.
Go to www.hillaryclinton.com.
Whether you're running for president of the United States,
Wow, look at this crowd.
or something a bit less glamorous, judge of the Hamilton County Court of Common Pleas.
When I was a little kid, I used to go watch my father in trial as county prosecutor and see the common pleas judge.
Hamilton County Commissioner Pat DeWine, a Republican, stunned political observers by dropping his bid for re-election this year, declaring instead for judge. DeWine received his party's endorsement and comfortably defeated Magistrate Kathy King in the primary, outspending her by more than 2.5 to 1.
A job that I've always looked at as tremendously important and had a great deal of respect for the office.
But a Local 12 investigation has found that DeWine, the Hamilton County Republican Party, and the State of Ohio Republican Party may have found a loophole in the rules on how judges run for office. Rules which are supposed to insulate judges from the potentially corrupting influence of money. The rule is in the Canon of Judicial Ethics, a guidebook for candidates for judge. Canon 7CA states as follows: a judicial candidate shall not expend funds in a judicial campaign that have been contributed to him or her to promote his or her candidacy for a non-judicial office. In other words, you cannot take money raised for, say, your county commission race, money you have in one pocket. You cannot take that money and transfer it over to your judicial race and put it into another pocket. Transferring money like that can give a candidate for judge an unfair advantage, a fundraising head start. Regular politicians can raise money whenever they want, year-round. But under the canons, judicial candidates cannot start till 120 days before the election. Plus, transferring money raised for another race could be a way to secretly funnel big contributions from big donors, which are limited under the canons to $500 per person in common pleas races. But if the rules say you cannot transfer money from your non-judicial race to your judicial race, what if you did something like this? What if you took money from your county commissioner fund and donated that money to somebody else, who donated money to somebody else, who donated money to you, to your judge fund? That could be a pretty big loophole. Look what happened, according to campaign finance records. On January 8, 2008, the Friends of Pat DeWine, his county commissioner fund, gave $31,140 to the Hamilton County Republican Party. Within weeks, the county party sent money to the state party, and the state party made contributions to DeWine for judge. Check this out. February 4th, Hamilton County sends $20,000 to the Ohio Republican Party. The very same day, the state party gives $10,131 worth of in-kind contributions, postage and flyers, to DeWine for judge. About a week later, Hamilton County sends another $10,000, and within a day, two contributions totaling $18,587 in more in-kind services go to DeWine's fund for judge. Plus, the amount of money here is pretty interesting. The canons say in a contested primary, which this was, a political party can spend no more than $30,000 on a common pleas candidate. Well, Pat DeWine basically gave the county party $30,000. The county party gave the state party $30,000 to the penny, and then the state party basically gave Pat DeWine $30,000 in his race for judge. DeWine says there was nothing fishy.
We looked up the law and we followed it very closely.
In trying to move from one elected office to another, DeWine says he did everything by the book.
If I have money in my right pocket, and I can't put it in my left pocket by rule, but I give it to somebody who gives it to somebody else who gives it back to me and puts it in my left pocket, isn't that getting around the rules?
Well, Jeff, that's absolutely not what we did. What we did was follow the rules very closely. And, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that Pat DeWine's a loyal Republican, and when it's time to liquidate his campaign account, he contributed money to the Republican Party.
By law, you cannot have two campaign funds at the same time. DeWine says he had to empty his commissioner account. And he says an Ohio Supreme Court advisory 98-7 says he can give that money to political parties and other candidates.
There were no strings attached. There were no conditions. I didn't ask for any of that back.
But DeWine did get a lot of money, not just from the state party in kind, flyers and postage, but from other candidates in cash. In emptying his commissioner fund of $84,000, DeWine not only gave money to the Hamilton County GOP, they got the biggest chunk, but he also gave money to dozens of individuals, to local political clubs, and to other Republican candidates. A few of those candidates gave money to DeWine as well. Take Treasurer Rob Gehring, for example. Records show DeWine gave Gehring's campaign $500. 10 days later, Gehring's committee gave $200 to DeWine for judge, and a month after that, $2,500 more. Recorder Rebecca Grappi's campaign got $500 from DeWine's commission fund and gave his judge fund $2,500. And DeWine also gave $5,000 to something called Ohio's 17 Star PAC, which then gave him $3,000, the most a PAC or political action committee can give by law in this kind of race. The 17 Star PAC, by the way, is run by DeWine's father, former Ohio Senator Mike DeWine.
Isn't that, in a sense, making the canons kind of pointless if you can just trade money back and forth?
Well, look, the reality is that, of course, I'm going to support my father. And, of course, my father's going to support me in every campaign that I've run in.
The Republican Party supports DeWine, too. No surprise there. Party Chair Alex Triantafilo was once a judge who had to operate under the same canons. He says everything Pat DeWine did and everything the GOP did was well within the rules.
It's certainly not what it appears to you. And in my view, this was a series of absolutely ethical, legal transactions of Pat emptying out his non-judicial campaign account in an effort to open a judicial campaign account.
But if transactions like DeWine's are within the rules, critics say the rules should be changed.
Common Cause believes that we really need a sweeping overhaul of the campaign finance laws in Ohio.
Bill Woods is Ohio chair of Common Cause, a citizens group which lobbies for reform in campaign finance laws nationwide.
Lawyers spend hours, days, thinking up ways of getting around those regulations.
Take Ohio Supreme Court Advisory 98-7, for example. The opinion DeWine and the GOP cite as allowing what they did. But while that advisory does let DeWine give his commissioner money to other candidates and parties, he still has to comply with other campaign finance rules.
Is it too easy to get around these things?
I think so.
And why should this matter to the voters? Because to critics like Bill Woods, in politics, money talks. In fact, money shouts. But money should not create even the appearance of impropriety.
You put this to the average citizen and they kind of throw up their hands and say, well, these elections are all bought and sold.
The Republicans, of course, deny that. The former judge?
In my view, and I think it's clear, that Pat did everything appropriate and ethical and legal in this case.
And the wants-to-be judge?
We follow the canons very closely.
But if you were the judge, what would you say?
Does what we see here pass the smell test? It might be legal, it might even be within the codes and the canons, but does it pass the smell test of the way things ought to be?
On the face of it, it looks, at the least, it seems to violate the spirit of the law here.
Any changes in the rules would have to come from the Ohio Supreme Court. Right now, this is only in the court of public opinion.
The smell test is a little stinky.
In other words, the judicial canons maybe empty cannons. Jeff Hirsh, Local 12.
Both the opponent of DeWine, defeated in the Republican primary, Magistrate Kathy King, and his Democratic rival for judge this fall, Norma Holt Davis, declined our request for an interview. If you would like to examine some of the documents used in this investigative report, go to our website, local12.com, and click on Get It Right Now. Stay tuned as the Democrats and Republicans prepare to gavel their national conventions to order in Minneapolis and Denver. Only the identity of the vice presidential candidates remains in doubt, and that will be decided before the conventions open. This was not the way it was when Cincinnati was the preferred site for national party conventions. Modern national political conventions have become television spectacles where each party coronates their champions, attacks and ridicules their opponents. And at least in front of the cameras, there is no division and no important decisions are made. Welcome back. American political parties have held national conventions since 1831. By throwing a bright light on these sometimes messy political spectacles, television frightened the party leaders who stripped the conventions of all real decision-making power and transformed them into scripted rallies, ruining the drama that television viewers found so interesting. In the mid-19th century, Cincinnati was America's great inland capital, and between 1856 and 1880 hosted 3 major party conventions. To discuss that history, I'm joined this morning by David Wolfford, an historian, a teacher at Marymount High School, and the author of numerous articles for a wide variety of popular and academic publications. David, welcome to Newsmakers.
Thank you for having me.
We've known each other for a while, and I've been in your classroom, and I know you watch Newsmakers, so it's good to have you on.
Thanks.
Conventions in Cincinnati. How many major political conventions have been held in Cincinnati and when?
Well, you cited 3, that's accurate, but there was actually a 4th one in 1872 that was a splinter of the Republican Party. So from the 1856 Democrat, the 1872, what was called the Liberal Republican Party, the 1876 convention that nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, and then the 1880 Democrat convention that nominated Winfield Scott Hancock.
Now these conventions, these are not like the conventions we see on TV today, right? These are very different types of political realities.
Yeah, they're not at all like today. For one, there was not even a primary election by this point. So, you know, the general populace didn't have much input at all as to who the nominee would be. And of course, they were much more contentious on the floor, much less certain as to who the contenders were as the convention approached. And a thing that a lot of people might find interesting is the nominees and the candidates generally weren't even in the city that held these conventions. So they didn't come to Cincinnati, these candidates. They would send an advance man, floor managers, and that kind of thing to try to further their cause as nominees.
Well, in fact, even well into the 20th century when William Hart Taft is nominated, there is this political fiction of him being officially informed that he's been nominated by the Republican Party. Now, with telephones by that time and everything, everybody knew all that, but there was this big parade 100 years ago to inform him on the steps of what we call the Taft Museum. So yeah, the candidates aren't there to rally the troops. It's all of their lieutenants who are doing that.
That's correct, yeah. You know, and quite often that's who made the call. These delegates and the leading campaign managers would sometimes arrive in Cincinnati ahead of time and start working their magic at the different hotels around town before the major portion of the delegation actually got here.
Okay, so from this period, 1856 to 1880, and it's a relatively brief period, there's these 4 conventions that are held in Cincinnati. Why was Cincinnati so popular? What made us an interesting place to hold a convention for that period of time, and then it stops?
Well, for one, you know, it just made geographical sense. It was in, fairly centrally located for the size and shape that America was at the time. It was easy access by rail and river. And then also there was quite a few influential people that brought these different conventions to Cincinnati for different reasons. Sometimes the nominees felt they could have the best chance here. Sometimes the press was quite influential in bringing the conventions to this town.
And might throw in one other thing, and we've got some full screens here of some of the convention facilities that we had in Cincinnati at the time.
Right.
Here's the Republican Convention in 1876. Music Hall wasn't finished yet in 1876, but then we can move on to Music Hall. And we may think of Music Hall as a place for the May Festival and the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, but it was also this great exposition center, and we promoted ourselves as the convention, the exposition capital of the United States. I mean, we forget about this.
Right. I think that's really what turned my interest into this in the first place. I think a lot of Cincinnatians today would be shocked to find this out. I mean, there is still quite a bit of interest in the presidential election here, but to have the convention here today would be quite a surprise.
Right. We just simply don't have the facilities. We can't handle the number of people that come to a convention. They're going to come in St. Paul. I was just in St. Paul a couple months ago and stayed right across the street from the hall where the Republicans are going to be. We just don't have the facilities that they've got. In that 1870 or 1856 convention, it was a Democratic convention, one of the things that had to be done at those conventions was really the work had to be done. You had to beat out a platform. You had to write a platform. And I've got a couple of things from the platform of 1856 in the Democratic Convention, which held, by the way, at this place called Smith and Nixon Hall. First off, one of the planks was the federal government has, quote, limited power and no power over slavery. This is 1856, before the Civil War. And abolitionists are called alarming and dangerous. So in a day when, with this Freedom Center, National Underground Railroad Freedom Center now open, and we spend a lot of time praising abolitionists, in 1856, the Democratic Party had to take a stand about what it believed, and it was drawing a very clear line in the sand. So these platforms were very important in those days.
Well, absolutely, and that's the convention that preceded the convention where the Democratic Party split 4 years later and really allowed Lincoln to win in 1860. So that was the main thrust of that platform, was limited federal government, maintaining slavery ultimately.
And it nominated James Buchanan, who I think we have an image of, who did become the president. They were successful. The convention was successful in nominating a winner, but didn't go on to have a great presidency, let's say.
No.
No, it was not a grand 4 years. Then let's take a look at 1872. This is this liberal Republican convention. Who's the key person in that?
Well, there's a few people that you want to consider. A senator from Missouri, his name was Carl Schurz, was really the kingpin of the operation, but he wasn't born in America, so he couldn't become the president. He couldn't become the nominee. So a handful of news editors didn't like the Grant administration. They wanted to get away from the spoils system. And so they brought in a handful of candidates. The likely candidate in the early season of the election was Charles Francis Adams. This is John Quincy Adams' son, but he did not get the nomination. It went to Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune.
You shared with us a great political cartoon here of Greeley. Here it is. Greeley riding a pig on his way to Cincinnati to the convention. Is the pig a reference to Cincinnati?
Absolutely. By this time it was a Porkopolis, and this is a cartoon I believe that came out on the eve of the convention, and people wondered how much Greeley wanted it, but probably in the back of his mind he'd been eyeing this nomination for some time.
Probably one of the most interesting of these conventions was the 1876 convention. And once again, there were a host of potential candidates when the convention opened in June of 1876, and nobody knew who was going to come out of this.
Well, that's right. That was probably the biggest surprise of all of them. Rutherford B. Hayes.
And this is the Republican convention, we should mention.
Republican 1876 you're speaking of here.
Right.
Rutherford B. Hayes was not born in Cincinnati, but was here as an established attorney before the Civil War. Joined and helped create actually the Literary Club, which is still here in Cincinnati, an active organization, and
held political office.
He was solicitor of the city, I believe. And he had moved on, and by 1876, when the convention was going to be here, he arrived to find a lot of his old friends helping him out. He was actually, I believe, 5th on the first ballot, so he was in 5th place. There was some political jockeying and some luck, quite simply, that allowed him to secure that nomination.
A political cartoon from the period, which shows the chair of the party putting all of these candidates through a meat grinder and trying to figure out which one's going to come out the other end. I mean, these are ugly. The backroom deals and the how long a particular candidate's going to stay in the race and how many ballots these things could go. How many? I mean, in that one, do you know how many ballots that went?
I believe that was maybe 7 ballots before Hayes was determined. The longest one was 1856, 17 ballots before Buchanan was actually
17
nominated.
ballots.
Right.
Now, here we're used to today in 2008, all the speculation right now. We now know because of the primary system who the presidential candidates are going to be in both parties. Now the speculation is who the vice presidential candidates are going to be. But we assume that the presidential candidate will name their vice president. How did it happen in the 19th century?
Well, it just wasn't that important at the time. With media and anticipation, we probably focus on it more now, or as balancing the ticket goes. But it wasn't much of a contest. It's quite often an afterthought. A lot of these conventions, a good portion of the delegation was gone from town before they even started nominating vice presidents.
Oh, really? So people would leave.
And when Hayes had secured the nomination, and they nominated William Wheeler from New York to join him. By the time they informed Hayes, who was of course at home, that he'd gotten the nomination and that Wheeler would be his running mate, he simply didn't know who he was.
He literally didn't know who he was. They had not met.
Had not met. He asked about his running mate.
So was it the sorts of considerations there balancing the ticket just as they are today?
I think so. That was a degree of balance to appease some of the candidates that didn't get nominated. The Wheeler was out of New York, so to give New York some representation.
One thing I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention was how important Ohio was in the 19th century. This was a huge state that delivered a lot of electoral votes. And so either for the Republicans, where the Republican Party was very strong here, or for the Democrats who were trying to counter the Republican strength in Ohio, Ohio was absolutely critical, which it still is today.
Sure, that's absolutely true. Surely there's some reason for the 2 conventions today being held in Minnesota and Colorado. Those are battleground states, so that was a calculated decision. And the same kind of thing happened then. In fact, the Democratic Party had put up Buchanan in 1856, and they didn't have a winner again, and then through the Civil War and after. And then as of 1880, that was one of the reasons they wanted to return to Cincinnati. They felt that might be what could put them over the top in the general election.
So what happened in 1880 when they do return to Cincinnati? How does that convention go?
Well,
and of course this is in the brand new Music Hall. This is in the great exposition center.
Well, the 1880 convention was surely the biggest. The town had learned how to handle conventions. The bars were expanded, and taverns were ready to host people.
Bars meaning saloons.
Right.
Yes. Okay.
Right. It came down to whether it was going to be in Washington, D.C. actually, or Cincinnati, and Cincinnati leaders and innkeepers and George Pendleton, a U.S. senator, he'd been a vice presidential nominee before, were able to persuade the party in Washington to have it in Cincinnati. And on the train ride back, he hung a banner from the train that said, "Cincinnati, she gave you your last Democratic president, and she will give you the next."
We're almost out of time, to about a half a minute. Is there something you wish you could go back and be part of those kinds of conventions rather than today's conventions?
Well, I'm not sure. The smoke-filled rooms comment that you mentioned earlier is what characterized these conventions. So I don't know that the democracy that we understand today would really be would have really been there.
TV would have loved this, though.
Absolutely.
Especially if we could have gotten in those smoke-filled rooms. that would have been fun. David, thank you very much. This is really fun. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Next week, the NAACP will be in town, and we will explore its future direction on a national level and its local origins. Have a good week.